If I were to be blunt, right, and to compare and contrast the experience I had in BCG Chicago versus BCG San Francisco, Chicago.
If you had to distill it to 3 important lessons that you've learned from your 7.5 years at BCG, What would that be?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, right? And it's something that I've been thinking about these days, especially now that I've had 1 year of distance after leaving consulting. So I would say the top 3 things. One is really your personal reputation matters a ton. And this is something that is both significant in the consulting context, but it has also helped me in a post-consulting context. In consulting, usually the staffing model is such that there will be different projects looking to staff consultants. And on the other side, there will be a supply and demand match where you as a consultant want to get on certain projects. And so the first thing that precedes you is actually your personal reputation as a consultant. Are you someone who has content knowledge? Are you someone who is able to be put in front of a client and can communicate effectively? Are you someone who is analytical? The second thing is that finding the right people to work with can really shape your experience. One story that comes to mind is like one time I was on a project in Amsterdam, and the partner on the project, he was someone who I had worked with previously, but like when basically the project was really, it was a really tough project. But towards the middle of the project, essentially my mother was hospitalized.
Oh.
I was in Amsterdam. I was not in North America. My mom was dealing with the like personal health struggles. And so I think at the time I felt very much like torn, right? Because like both I was like on this really hectic, demanding project, right, but I felt like my attention was not 100% on the project itself. And so I'll remember always like what the partner said. His name was Dustin. And so Dustin told me that above all, like family matters the most and culture is set from the top. What he cared about is he really lived and preached those values where he was like, you should get on a flight the next morning out back to Canada, actually. The job will always be there. We can always find people there. Like, even though you are someone who, basically, even though your role is it's an important role for the client, but you're not irreplaceable. Like, they can always find someone else. And so I think getting back to that second lesson, finding the right people, whether it's the right mentors, the right partners, or even the right coworkers. The third point is that consultants always say it depends. The reason why I wanted to kind of just draw attention to the word like it depends is that through consulting, I've appreciated nuances of like a lot of times there is maybe a correct answer from a first principles point of view, but the answer truly depends, depending on what you're trying to achieve, depending on what the circumstances. And the right answer like 2 years ago may not be the right answer now, given where the company or the client's situation is.
Absolutely. So in summary, I think you mentioned 3 things in terms of A, your reputation matters, B, finding the right people to work with, which almost sounds like culture also matters, and C, whether to determine consulting as a right job for you. The timing of your life is also very dependent on it as well. I like to click on a few things. So in terms of reflecting the time when you were working in Amsterdam, I'm sure it would have been a very stressful situation for you. Do you believe that is more representative of the BCG as a culture, or was it more team specific?
Yeah.
And if so, what would be the best practices to find the right team for you?
Yeah, no, I think culture matters tremendously. And it's one of the reasons why. So if I kind of rewind back to when I was in undergrad, I was choosing which law office location. At the time, I chose Chicago despite never having lived in the city, because one of my upperclassmen essentially told me that BCG Chicago had a great culture. Great culture, not just from a work-life balance point of view. I mean, everything is relative, right? Because consulting
Absolutely.
is a grind for a lot of people. But culture matters in the sense of, for example, if I were to be blunt, right, and to compare and contrast the experience I had in BCG Chicago versus BCG San Francisco, Chicago historically has been a large office for BCG, and it's an office where a lot of the senior partners from the 80s, from the 90s are in that office.
Oh, interesting.
And so it has a lot of the culture from back in the day when BCG was still a much smaller company than I don't know, I think it's like 7,000 or 8,000 people now globally.
Right.
Versus San Francisco is a much more transitory office, right? And so I think the average tenure, I don't know, I don't have the actual data on this, but just based on my personal anecdotal observations, people in San Francisco tend to leave after 2 years. Just a lot of people who transfer into SF and who also transfer out to tech. So I think that matters in terms of shaping culture. And so I think like very practically, right? Like a couple of clues that I would think about as I'm trying to determine the culture fit of an office. One is just like, are people who are in that office, right? Like, are they there for longer than average, right? Like, if they're bouncing like in a year or 2 years, then that's probably a red flag.
Right.
The second thing is also like, are the people who are there, like, are they people who, even in the conversations that, for example, if you do like coffee chats with people, right? Like, is what's on top of mind and like top framework, or it's what's most salient for them. The fact that they have to go home and take care of their kids, right? And so Chicago was a place where it was very family friendly, and the proportion of people, senior partners and partners who had kids was way higher than San Francisco. And so there's like these subtle clues that can kind of give you an indication of, from a work-life balance point of view, like,
I see.
is it going to be sustainable? The other thing was also from an industry point of view. That's one of the factors that I think people overlook, which is if you are a consultant on a project that is consulting for financial services, right?
Right.
And Jay, obviously you've been in financial services for a long time. Now, if you have consultants on the other side working for you, and you yourself are working till like 10 p.m., right? Like if they bounce at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m., that's not a good look.
Yes.
Versus for a lot of my projects, right, like in industrial goods or consumer goods in the Midwest, the clients will leave at 5 or even before that to pick up their kids, right? And so that also sets the expectation in terms of, as a consultant, when you are being paid like all this money, what is the client's expectation essentially for you?
I see.
That also shapes a lot.
That's really interesting. One other point that you've mentioned was the phase of your life is also very important. And for someone who joined consulting right after undergrad and returned after business school, was that the right point? Like looking back, if you can start all over again, would you still pick consulting as your first job?
Yeah, it's a hard question because I think one, hindsight is 2020. I think really knowing like what drives you matters. And so in my case, right, like for me, consulting provided stability and security. It provided the optionality for me to even go to business school. And I think thirdly, the looking back at where my step is now, right? Like the skill set I've gained, I joined a startup after BCG, and now I'm actually leaving the startup to go to a bigger tech company. And my ability to kind of pivot from consulting different industries to a startup that was focused on batteries to now going to a cybersecurity focused B2B SaaS company is a result of me having been in consulting and my ability to jump. I would attribute that to consulting.
That's very interesting because, what I'm really curious about is it seemed like people who have consulting backgrounds usually have a lot of optionality. What are the typical pathways or career opportunities that open up after spending 4, 5, 6 years in consulting?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, right? So I have two reactions to this. One is kind of talking through like, depending on when you leave consulting, what the different pathways are.
Right.
The second one is actually more general in terms of how I envision my own career. So actually, maybe let me start with the general part, which is for me, like the career advice that I resonate with. I read this somewhere from the CSO, the Chief Strategy Officer of FAIR. And so he had this blog which was saying like when you're in your 20s, the focus on discovery and exploration and learning skill set matters a lot. And I resonate with that. And so consulting in my 20s allowed me to explore. In my 30s, the next step is essentially gaining domain specialty knowledge, right? Which is like, how can I specialize on something, whether it's functionally or industry or content-wise, so that I can become an expert in my 30s. And then in my 40s, essentially, how do I make an impact?
Right.
Given that I have expertise, it could be content, it could be people management, it could be skill set related, or it could just be like by virtue of like you having been in enough companies and pattern recognition. And so for me, consulting was really good in terms of for me to have stayed 7 to 8 years in consulting, allow me to explore many different things and checks that box. And now kind of coming back to your original question, there's usually, I would generalize and say there's probably like 4 types of pathway points. So one is like if you join right after undergrad and leave consulting in 2 to 3 years. So this is when you have the most optionality in terms of people in my cohort who left after 2 years in consulting, like they're probably like 23, 24, 25. You can basically join corporate strategy. You can go to a startup, like early stage. You can go to like big tech companies. You can go to finance. You can go to PE. You can also go to business school, right? Like, so those are some common pathways. You can also start your own company. There's definitely a few where like that's the age to take a lot of risks, and maybe they're starting something in YC. And so that's pathway number 1. Pathway number 2 is people who I would say like are going to business school, right? They did consulting for a few years, and then maybe they happen to be sponsored by their consulting firm to go to business school. And during business school, they decide to pivot careers. The third type of people, I would say I fall in this pathway, which is like leaving after a few years after doing my MBA. And so in this camp, I would say the optionality shrinks, but there's still plenty of optionality. And so if I look at my recruiting journey after consulting, so I joined a late stage growth stage startup in the series like H, their series H. And so I would say that's pretty typical. Like, so growth stage startups, early stage is a bit harder given that the skill set that I have in terms of being able to do strategy projects versus the skill set that earlier stage startups need, there's a bit of a mismatch. And then the final path, right, is like, if you stick around, and so at BCG, if you are like 4 years after business school, usually you will be a principal or like junior partner at that point. And so at that point, right, like your optionality actually really shrinks. And so I would say like at that point, because your compensation expectation is so high, there's actually very few companies that will be willing to hire you for things that are not strategy related, right? And so depending on the industry, depending on the economic cycle, right, like that group actually, like, yes, you can find good exits. For example, you can be like a director of strategy and all these, but it becomes much more limiting, right, in that sense. So let me just pause here because I think those are some of the common like archetypes.
No, that makes sense, and it's really helpful to understand, which kind of exits that you have within certain seniorities. And one thing that I've overheard a lot was that it seemed like the firms or consulting firms really want the people to succeed.
Yep.
Were they actually helpful in your search as you were thinking about exiting the firm? And if so, what kind of resources do they really provide? Or is that a myth?
It's definitely not a myth. I would say concretely, there's a few things. So I think one, like there's this notion that maybe before we talk about the actual resources, I think it's important to understand why consulting firms are doing, providing post-career, like essentially they're helping you find your next job after a consulting firm, right? Which is kind of counterintuitive. Like most other company or industries don't do that. But for consulting firms, they do that because it comes down to if they are able to find you an exit that is that you're happy about, and in general, like that is expanding the sales pipeline for the consulting firm.
Potential clients.
For potential clients, right? And that's actually so at least at BCG, at one point, 90% of our revenue was from recurring clients.
Oh, wow.
Right. And so in that sense, the cost of acquiring new client relationships, you can interpret this data however many different ways you want. But I think the fact is, right, like a lot of times, like for partners to sell consulting service, it is usually to someone who they have a deep trusting relationship with. And usually like ex-BCG people or ex-consultants tend to be able to form that relationship very quickly.
I see.
So that's kind of the why behind it. In terms of the what or the how of what I personally benefited from BCG, right? Like one, like there's a career service portal where they will actually like do a lot of job postings. And I think in my experience, even just contrasting it very directly with the Wharton career portal, it is 100 times more effective than the Wharton portal in my search experience.
Oh.
In terms of the leads that are being posted on there are usually really targeting the consulting skill set.
Right.
They will filter for your tenure. They'll filter you for your expertise. there's usually like a contact email. And when I reach out to those postings on BCG's website, it's probably like a 25 to 50% response rate, which is really
That's
high.
impressive.
So that's really high, right? Especially in the current economic downturn.
Oh, absolutely.
That's number one. The second thing is actually they will provide you with what we call transition period. Others will call it like search period. And so I was able to have like 3 months of vote time off, but then actually you can take half pay. And so I was actually able to have 6 months half paid time off to be very dedicated to finding my next job. During that time, I am still employed by BCG, but essentially like my full-time job is just like finding the next job.
That's really nice that the firm will actually provide you with a dedicated time and you can be honest about your intentions.
Correct.
For your next stage of life.
And I think that's the third thing, which is like being honest about your intentions is something that, because now I have done like 2 career switches, or I've done 1 additional career switch after consulting. And in my recent contrasting when I left BCG versus when I left the startup, right? Like that's something that you can be completely open at BCG about, and people are willing to help you, right? And so this partner, he knew that I was going on transition, and he essentially like personally connected me with one of the clients, and that essentially got me a final round interview like within the week. There's like small things too, right? Which is like BCG hosts an annual alumni dinner.
Oh, really?
Every single year in San Francisco, where all the ex-BCG alums actually do show up. And so not all, but like a significant number of alums do show up. And like that's an opportunity where you can network, right? And so there's a lot of these things that are based on relationship. And I'll just pause there.
And also that's why it probably reconnects with your first learning, your reputation matters.
Correct.
I mean, you've officially made me jealous of your career path and you've convinced that consulting might be the best way to start your career. Understanding that, I'm now curious about what were some of the tough, difficult moments that you had while you were actually working in consulting.
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? Because I think this goes back to the first thing I mentioned in our conversation, which is consulting is objectively not a better career than others. It is only the right career depending on your goals, essentially, right? And so to answer your question, in my case specifically, the lifestyle is it's one of the key reasons that made me decide to leave consulting. And I would say, if you look at my experiences when I was an associate, so right after undergrad, and so for associates, like that lifestyle of me being on the road, like flying on Monday morning at 6 a.m., coming back on Thursday at like 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. was not really an issue because I was in a new city. And to be honest, I didn't have a big social life, or I didn't have like things that I really wanted to do outside of work when I was like 22 or 23, right? And so, but contrasting that with the last couple of years in San Francisco, for example, I met my partner and we're like, she's no longer a consultant. And for us, as we think about the next phase in our relationship and really settling down, that's when the lifestyle of being a travel consultant really kind of doesn't help solve that, right? It's not something that I can solve, because as professional services, that is what the expectation is,
right?
In exchange for all of the things that consulting provides. So that's number one, right? Which is, I remember there was one time when my last project, I was based in San Francisco and the project was based in Reading, Pennsylvania, which most people probably wouldn't have heard of other than on Monopoly. It's the first tile, like the Reading Railroad. And that journey was like almost like a 10-hour one-way journey, fly to Philly, then drive for like 2.5 hours from the West Coast, right? And so that became really, really difficult. And I remember there would be times in which I would just be thinking like, why am I doing this, right? So in that case, I really did like the clients and I had a good team, but it was not something where I could see myself being personally fulfilled to that extent that I was willing to trade off all of the other things that I was beginning to build in San Francisco. So that's number one. The second thing about consulting is, because reputation matters, if you start off on the right foot with someone, then it can help you get to places and unlock doors very quickly.
Yep.
But so in my case, right, like there was a project I remember, this was my second project. After I had done my first project for 6 months, the first project was focused on, we called it PMO. It was all about like facilitating meetings and taking notes and doing process optimizations. it didn't allow me to actually get the skill set of hardcore data analysis. And so by the time I went to my second project, it was very transparent that I didn't have any quantitative skills. And plus on top of that, we had my client counterpart was I forget her title, but she was essentially the chief accountant at the company. And so she had all these data that we needed to get from her in order for us to do our analysis. But time and time again, she would just essentially delay it by a week. And so after 4 weeks of doing that, essentially it had reached a point where, because I couldn't get the data from her, that was actually at risk of like delaying all of the other work streams.
Right.
Right. And so that became one of the things where, and to answer your question of like when it was like really difficult, like that was really difficult, which is actually having to confront her and be really assertive, because my personality naturally is not someone who bulldozes.
But as someone who's right out of college, how did that fall on your laps as your responsibility? It seems like there should have been some mid-level person in there speaking on your behalf to that chief accountant.
Yeah, and so I think it's a really good question, right? Because in that case, part of the thing that makes consulting really rewarding, but also mentally very stressful, is that even as a 22-year-old, 21-year-old, like new grad associate at BCG, you're expected to take 100% ownership over the work stream or the task that you're given. And so in this case, the project manager at the time, like he was actually interfacing with the chief like revenue officer. Right. And so I was reporting to him. And so naturally my client counterpart was the accountant person who was reporting to the chief revenue officer. And so in that case, right, like it was one of those things where I felt deeply insecure because I didn't know that this was about automotive tires of all things. Right. So I didn't know the business.
Right.
And my counterpart was someone who was like 25 years my senior. And so in that sense, right, like there was a huge power imbalance. And I think being able to navigate that as a 22-year-old without either one coming across just like, I don't know what I'm talking about, or second, like bulldozing to a point where like you become pretentious, right? Those are kind of the two pitfall traps.
Right.
It's actually really hard to navigate. And I think as a result of that, like my manager gave me a lot of feedback in terms of how I can actually flex my communication style to not, so in this case, to be a bit more direct and to be a lot more clear in terms of, hey, if we don't receive this, here's what the consequences are going to be. And actually, if that's going to delay the project, then we will have to do this other thing instead. And we'll need to escalate, right? So I think that's one of the things that actually puts young consultants in that dilemma, which is technically we don't know what we're doing, right? But we are given this task from usually your counterpart's boss's boss, right? But nobody likes being told, especially if you go behind our backs, right? Your boss's boss to escalate.
And that's a subtle art. Like, I mean, speaking for myself, I still struggle with that today. So I'm very interested. So it seems like you kind of pick up all these skills as you're working as a consultant. If you're trying to advise, or let's say you have a junior associate who just joined straight out of college.
Yep.
What are some things that you would teach them or teach your younger self on how to excel or how to facilitate or expedite this learning curve?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I really struggled with a couple of things. Advice number one I would give to my younger self of like 22-year-old at the time was, it's a version of being yourself, but at the same time, it's recognizing that. So basically, I think to give you the quick back context, right? Like my first couple of projects were all staffed in the Midwest. This was my first time in Chicago. I did not grow up in an environment where there was a lot of white people. And for me, like there was a deep insecurity in terms of like, can I connect with my clients who were my parents' age and who talks about minor league baseball? And as someone who, I mean, you know me, right?
Yeah.
Like, I can barely tell you like who the latest like, I can barely tell you the latest like pop culture phenomenon Like,
Right.
what Kendrick Lamar like perform at that, right? Like, these are topics that are super foreign to me and actually makes me deeply anxious to even have these conversations because I know I don't know what I'm talking about, and I know that's what these people like talking about, right? And so in that case, like there was already coming in, there's a saying in Chinese which is 先入为主, which is I had a assumption about the people who I was going to be working with, and actually I was self-limiting myself in terms of I had this fear that I wasn't able to connect with my clients, and that I needed to talk about sports because that's a broy culture. So that's, I think, like recognition number one, right? Which is it will tell my younger self to be aware of what is happening internally inside of me, to probably see a therapist much sooner than I did, to be aware of all these feelings of anxiety, insecurity, but at the same time, remind myself, the younger self, and actually I constantly do this every day, right? Which is the fact that I'm in the same room with the other person, no matter how different they are on paper or like on the surface of things, the fact that I'm even having this conversation means that I'm much more similar to them than I'm different.
Right.
Otherwise, we wouldn't even have the opportunity to have a conversation, right? And I think that channeling a little bit more of that mindset and not limiting myself and like tensing up is something that I wish and I'm actually still struggling with that, right? Which is like, how do I actually connect with people who are very different? And I think I realized that, so contrasting that experience in Milwaukee versus my last project in Reading, Pennsylvania, the client demographics are similar, but I think on my last one, right, like I was able to feel a lot more at ease because I was very upfront. I was like, hey, like I don't really know sports, right? Like, but I know you send your kid to play minor league baseball. Like, what is that like? Like, can I come along? And actually, like me and this guy named Frank, who's the head of engineering, he sends his kid, he's basically a coach for minor league baseball. Like he explained to me and we would talk about the games and like we would essentially go grab dinner, right? We would talk about other things that we had in common. And I will share about what my experience being in Philadelphia was. And then how I was like a nominal Eagles fan in essence, right? And so like slowly, I think then that trust and relationship began to be built. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I learned like throughout, I don't know if it's because of consulting, but definitely through my 20s, is how to just really be aware when situations are such that I am insecure or anxious because I perceive the other person to be different from me, and to actually try to be a bit more of myself and to kind of find common topics of interest.
That makes sense. I think, something that is really important is understanding, who you are and, knowing when the anxiety arises and address it appropriately, because I feel like, speaking for myself, a lot of times if you don't address that anxiety, it comes out in a way that it just becomes really ugly. That's right. And you're actually, instead of pulling people in, you're pushing them out.
Exactly. Consulting puts you under the microscope where you as a very young like baby consultant, you're expected to be a subject matter expert with people who naturally have this skepticism. And I would too if I were on the other side of like, what do you know that you can add value to my job?
Got it. And now, since you've successfully convinced me that consulting is a perfect job, how would you advise, someone in their undergraduate or business school how to recruit for consulting, or in particular for BCG?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? So talking about very practical things, the things that I'm saying, part of me is trying to bridge that to the current version of recruiting, because as everybody knows, like COVID has changed a lot in terms of the name of the game when it comes to recruiting. But still, like a couple of fundamental tenets still apply. So one is being able to actually meet as many people from the companies that you're interested in as possible, right? And that's not going to be like new like career advice,
right?
But I think the caveat I will add there is like, don't waste your time talking to people who are from, and so depending on which element matters to you, like one is almost like making a set of like, what are the things that matters to you, right? Like does location matter to you? Does industry matter to you? Does the flexibility of going to business school matter to you, right? Like, does like geographical, like international assignment matter to you, right? Certain firms like McKinsey or BCG will naturally give you more opportunities to go abroad versus like smaller local-based firms, right? Like, which ones are truly the things that matter? And I will focus on talking to folks at these companies who are within your like Venn diagram or like the overlap, so things that matter. And a concrete example I'll give, right, is that like I had no interest, for example, in going to New York after undergrad. And so I talked to a bunch of people who are actually from the New York office because they were essentially the people who I had been able to connect with. But I realized like at the end of the day, right, like there's so many people out there who you could be able to talk to, who you can talk to that. And consulting and recruiting is such an intensive, like demanding numbers game that I would just really be focused on the offices that you're curious about and the companies that you're curious about.
Got it. So in terms of networking, what you've just talked about, when you're asking those questions, is it helpful in terms of recruiting purposes, or is it helpful to find the right job that is aligned with your needs and interests?
Yeah, depending on the person, right? Like, so I'm going to use it depends. If you're someone who is interested in consulting, but you're not sure that this is going to be something that you're all in, then talking to people will help you validate. Like, and I almost treat it, maybe this is just like the way I think about things. I would treat it like in the same way that like you're meeting someone in dating, right? Like, is this person someone who you could see working together? Like, did you enjoy your conversation? How did it make you feel? Like, is this someone who you would like to see again, right? Like, but in the recruiting context, I would think about like, how was your conversation with this person? Does the culture, the vibe, the way they talk, the things that they care about, the way that they communicate with you, right? Like, are those things in which you resonate a lot with? Or are there red flags, even from the way that this person is talking? And I would say like one example, there's subtle things, right? Like subtle differences between different companies and also consultants versus non-consultants. Like, try to probe them on how they talk about their current projects or how they talk about their clients. Certain firms, I won't name names, right? Like, would talk about clients potentially in a condescending way, right? And then like, if that is something that matters to you, then that's a red flag, right? I would try to think through, based on your interaction with these people, like, are they people you like working with?
Right.
I think that's what I meant.
And to be more blunt,
Yeah.
if you're sitting on the other side of the table hiring, juniors, do you check whether this junior talked with someone on your team?
So I actually surprisingly was not directly involved in the recruiting process, but I was the person like who was sent to like different campuses and talk with people a bunch of times. Like, we would provide very detailed notes on like, say there's like 20 people who signed up for copy chat, right? Like, who are the ones that we actually connected with?
Oh,
interesting. What are the things we talked about?
Okay.
I forget their rating, but essentially like there's some sort of numeric rating, like are we more bullish on this person versus others, right? And so all these are signals that feed into that first step, which is like, are you able to get an interview? And then once you get an interview, right, like having these people who you talk with, especially from the offices where you actually would like to work at, like that can actually, you can now turn that around and they can be your sources for collecting more information. Got it.
Were there any common mistake these college kids would make and, something to avoid during these networking sessions?
Yeah, I think I'll flag that my recruitings were done in 2014. Right. So that was like 10 years ago. If there are still massive events where there's like information sessions where these consulting or any company comes on campus and there's like tens or hundreds of people who are attending, the advice I had back in the day was usually like the dynamic would be maybe there's like 10 people from the company who are there and there's like each person will be surrounded by like a circle of like 10 like students or prospective people. It's really hard actually to get a conversation in that moment.
Right.
So the best advice I heard from someone back in the day was like, show up like 20 minutes early. And then stay 20 minutes behind. You can skip the entire middle of the section. Like, maybe this is not kosher advice, but like for you to be able to try to actually get a word in when there's 10 people surrounding one person is really difficult. And actually, like, it could come off in the wrong way, especially for a culture like, and I would say this about myself, right? Like, for BCG Chicago, like, potentially, like, if you're someone who is very clearly like bulldozing over other people in the way that you're interacting, right? Like, that's a red flag
Right.
for me. So that's one of the things I've heard.
That's a genius advice. Show up 20 minutes early, you leave an impression. And if you're also staying behind, I would be very impressed with that candidate.
Yeah, and I think like also depends on the person, right? Because I would say I'm in the middle of like introvert versus like extrovert. Like, but in these sessions, like, it can be very nerve-wracking when there's so many people. And so if you're not someone who feels extremely comfortable being like a extroverted networker, you can also ask for their contact.
Right.
We usually have business cards, right? And I would just send them an email to ask for time later in the week, so that you can have that time to actually talk with them one-on-one. So I think for me, the point of these big network sessions is for you to figure out like who are the people who you can basically reach out to, because those will be designated by the firms as like kind of networking like recruiters. And actually, if there's any basic information about the firm that you can't otherwise find online, which I am skeptical that there's anything that you cannot actually find online. So
Got it. No, that's really helpful. That's good to know.
yeah, and sorry, I'll just add one small thing, right? Which is everything that I have described is for someone who, and like myself, right, is privileged enough to be at a target school or a school where consulting firms do recruit at. And so if that's not your situation, then I do think like the value of like actually reaching out, whether it's on LinkedIn or like finding people's emails. And so finding people email, like the way that we do things, and actually maybe this is common knowledge, but most firms follow a very standard email format. And so BCG's case is last name dot first name. So mine was wong.allen at BCG. I would just reach out, right? Like the chances are like maybe you won't get a reply, but actually if you're at a place where you need to find more people to talk to from these firms, like sending them a personalized email message, look up their LinkedIn, see what they've done, and send a message to connect, like usually will have pretty good results.
Got it. Now I'm more curious to know about, your thoughts post consulting.
Yeah.
So it's been a year you left BCG?
It's been coming up on a year, actually. And specifically the question is about what I thought about now that I have some distance with consulting.
Right.
What I think about consulting. I would say there's two main themes. One, which is now that I've left and I've spoken to a lot of friends who are actually, I've already also left or are in that situation, same boat of trying to leave, I'm gaining an appreciation for actually just how varied people's experiences were. And I count myself lucky because I was able to have good mentors who invested in me. But that was not the case with a lot of people. And so I think that's one reflection I've had, which is, again, it comes down to like, it's such a crapshoot in some ways, right? Because a lot of it is luck, but a lot of times how your experience in consulting is and what you learn comes down to the people who you met. And which is why it's so important to find people in the early days who you connect with, because that culture essentially is reflected off the way that they talk, even in that 20-minute conversation. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think what I've been realizing, and part of it might be recency bias, like given that I have spent the past essentially 6 to 7 months actively looking for a job and being turned away at many different interviews, I'm realizing that 10 years ago, like consulting had a prestige factor, which today it might still have that, which opens a lot of doors. But the market right now, depending on the geography, and so I will only speak in my situation, which is in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area in tech, there is more consultants trying to enter tech than tech can absorb, right? And so then part of something that I've been feeling is that it's been a really humbling experience actually to kind of think through like what are the skill sets that I can offer to this prospective company, and not just rely on the brand name of BCG,
Right.
right? And that's something that I think for me was a new learning in that sense. And I count myself lucky because I spent 2 years within BCG's digital venture and BCG Gamma, which are our divisions within BCG focused on product management and data science. And so during the interviews, I talk about those skill sets and experiences. And that helps differentiate me from another consultant who might have only done strategy roles.
Got it. No, that's very thoughtful and honest response. I think we're almost done, but I just had a quick question that
Sure.
popped into my mind. I think consulting, you guys are more the way that a lot of people view consultants as jack of all trades, excellent human capital where you can deploy and start solving problems. How do you think consulting will change as AI gets more developed?
The AI question.
Like it can be just industry in general or the experience for younger people who joins as associate.
Yeah, I'll offer my very uninformed 2 cents. One is, like many professional service industries, the junior and the entry-level consultants are going to be hit very hard, especially as I think back to when I was a associate at BCG, the things I did in my first 6 months, right, which were doing data analysis, crunching data, providing summary of different reports, ghostwriting different emails for my manager to read and proofread before I can send, right? Like all these things, or setting up meetings, right? Like they're all things that the agentic AI can do, right? And they're things that all of the AI models these days are fully capable of if given the right prompting.
Right.
And so one of the biggest challenges for consulting industry, if I think about someone who's trying to enter right now, is thinking through, there's probably just a window of time before you're able to acclimate to the consulting skill set that is truly valuable. So it almost like becomes two things, right? Like bifurcated, which is for the entry level skill set, those can be replaced by AI. But for the skill set that a more experienced consultant have, which is essentially, given that your analysis work is done, like what are the conclusions that you draw from these analysis, and how do you actually influence stakeholders, which are humans,
Right.
to make decisions based on uncertainty? Like those are things that consultants are valued for. And actually, one interesting phenomenon is that for BCG, right, like even though economic downturn has been real for the past couple of years, and there's a lot of layoffs, but BCG has been going through this cycle of like ups and downs, and actually business has been maybe not fully depending on the sector, but it has been booming actually, because there's a lot more uncertainty, even though there's a lot more AI tools at disposal, but clients are still relying on someone who they can perceive to be trustworthy and an expert in guiding them for that next direction, right? And that is something that has been universal for the past however many decades. I would think that a key implication of AI is that previously, like the work done by one consultant can now be multiplied.
Right.
And so if you are a consulting manager or a senior consultant, before maybe you are managing like 4 junior associates, maybe now you're just managing AI, right? Maybe if you're a manager, previously you had like 2 projects simultaneously at the same time, but now maybe you're doing 5 projects at the same time, right? And so the workload essentially expands potentially without eating. So basically, I think one prediction I have is that the consulting bandwidth is going to be much more fragmented. You're a more experienced consultant.
Nice.
Because you have to juggle many different things now.
Oh, that's a very thoughtful response. Well, thank you very much. How did you feel about today's discussions?
No, this was interesting, right? Because I think this gave me a chance to also to reflect actually on my 7 to 8 years in consulting. And I am deeply grateful, I think, to BCG, and hopefully I think something that I'm trying to caveat like again and again is my experience is not, my experience might be of the minority, right? In terms of how people's experiences have been in consulting. So I encourage people to really think through like what is the right thing that matters to them at the moment before deciding to jump full on into consulting like from the beginning.
It makes sense. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.